This is When Science Speaks, a new web series profiling innovative and interesting people working in science and technical fields, from academia to industry to the nonprofit world. We explore how to be a powerhouse advocate for science and your research, how to advance your career in meaningful ways that make you happy, and how to push back on the ongoing assault on science and other related issues of interest happening in the world.
Well, hey everyone, it's Mark Baer, and you are tuned to When Science Speaks. This episode of the show is sponsored by Baer Strategic Consulting in Washington, D.C., which helps scientists get funding, gain influence, and build proven, powerful communication skills for interacting effectively with the stakeholders who matter most in their professional world. Reaching those goals often involves effective translation of complicated research into engaging jargon-free communication. Interested in getting a free resource to help you do just that? Go to complexitymadeclear.com to get the 11 keys for translating complexity. That's complexitymadeclear.com to get your free infographic used by science communicators at major organizations to boil down, but never dumb down, complicated science and technical topics for general audiences. I am so pleased to welcome Marc Sedam to the show today. Marc leads the research communication and investment enterprise for the world-class research at NYU Langone Health and New York University. He's an experienced leader with a track record of positive cultural, financial, and performance gains, also an internationally recognized expert in the fields of innovation, commercialization, early-stage startup support, technology transfer, and related areas. He is a former biotech chief operating officer who also led logistics and creation of the University of New Hampshire's best-in-class COVID lab testing facility and program. Welcome to the show, Marc. Wonderful to have you here.
I'm happy to be here.
Technology transfer is a buzzword that many listeners may have heard before, but it's one of those terms that doesn't necessarily really describe the array of experiences and roles involved. And as a longtime leader and self-described evangelist for the field of tech transfer, could you paint a picture for listeners to fill in the specifics? And maybe is there a story or two that could help listeners envision what it might be like to work in tech transfer?
Sure. I guess for the members of your audience who are on LinkedIn, what it's not is IT. I can't count the number of things that asked me to help them implement their technology platforms at a university. So it's funny. The phrase technology transfer means different things to different people, and it actually means different things in different countries. So in the US, we tend to call it technology transfer as a sort of a code for the commercialization of science in a university setting or in a nonprofit setting. In Europe and Southeast Asia, they tend to call it knowledge transfer. And so you'll see similar words meaning the same thing, but I'm sure you have a global reach. And so for the folks over the pond, if they hear knowledge exchange and knowledge transfer and technology transfer, they're all sort of pieces of the same puzzle. And some of the evolution of that will answer the question. Back when I started in what is now known as technology transfer in the mid-90s, it really was just licensing intellectual property. So universities are one of the largest creators of knowledge, or are the largest creator of knowledge in the world. That knowledge can be converted into things like patents and copyrights and trademarks. And then the job of the tech transfer office traditionally was to license those technologies to companies to create products out of the IP and then bring those to market. What's happened over the last 15 years generally, and then 5 years, I think more specifically, is that role has expanded to mean all sorts of things. Yes, we still do intellectual property licensing. Yes, it's primarily patents, but we're seeing a lot of work with copyrights and trademarks and curricula and tools, educational tools, and the value of tools. But it also goes beyond that into helping start companies, economic development regionally and nationally, and helping to contribute more directly to your backyard. So we think a lot about job creation and how the intellectual enterprise at NYU, how many jobs does that create? What direct benefit we provide to New York City and New York State specifically? So it's gone from something that was really niche to something that is broad. And I think the reason that it's become more noticed is because the breadth of the job had started to creep into things that people don't necessarily see universities going to.
Really helpful. And thanks for teasing out the difference in terminology between the US and other parts of the world, because we will have listeners who will hear that and interpret it differently based on where they are, and many are outside the US. This next question really leads from the last one, which are some of the maybe common misperceptions or blind spots that the average person, so to speak, has about tech transfer. You talked about that already. One aspect, though, that I know would be interesting to listeners is the value that tech transfer or knowledge exchange, the value that it adds to society generally.
I'm going to answer this in sort of contrasting terms, hopefully not conflicting, but definitely contrasting. So I think the most common misperception is that we're all in it for the money. In other words, we do these transactions to generate income. It's the most important thing that we do. So the dollar is the most important aspect of licensing. And while it's true, when we do licenses, we expect to receive a return if the thing that we have intellectual property on does get converted into a product, or as I say to our licensees all the time, value created, value shared. So we create the opportunity, which is the usually very broad, very fundamental intellectual creation in the form of a patent. And then the company then spends a lot of resources, time, and energy developing that into a product. And we tend to share income. Universities, depending on the technology, will get a royalty, but it tends to be in the single digits and the mid to low single digits, depending on the tech, although I've certainly done deals with a 20% royalty. So, most people look at tech transfer and say, this is about money. And it's really not that. What we really try to do, and this I think I can speak on behalf of the profession, is we're trying to get ideas out into society for societal benefit and to put those ideas to work. And so what I like to say to people is, yes, of course, if a product sells $1 billion and it's based on our IP, we would expect a share of that revenue stream. But we only get revenue when products reach the market. It's very hard for us to make any money unless that idea goes out into society and provides benefit. So we really do find ourselves focused on what's the easiest, what's the fastest, what's the most efficient path to get that idea to the market, and with whom is the best partnership to do that. If it works and the product reaches there and has a positive benefit on society, of course, we'll make some revenue from that. But if it never reaches that, there's no revenue to be gained. And so that flips the idea on its head, which is to mean if I could create a license or a transaction where the product reaches the market and the university doesn't get any revenue, I would do that if that was the right thing to do. But generally speaking, of course, if it does reach the market and there's lots of sales and everybody else gets to keep some money, then yes, we want the return too.
Thank you for that. I don't think most people really grasp that aspect of the work that you do. And you've been an inventor, board advisor, university lecturer, tech transfer leader, of course. Can you share with listeners elements of your career journey so far, perhaps highlighting particularly consequential decision points and how you manage them, or even also skills that have been really useful in the variety of roles you've had in the tech transfer ecosystem?
But yeah, there's been an interesting shift in the profession. So I started in tech transfer in 1996 at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. At that point, profession that we now think of as tech transfer was relatively young. By the Bayh-Dole Act, which is the law that provides the ability for tech transfer to exist in the United States in its current form, was in 1980. So this is only 16 years, 15 and a half years after legislation changed to allow this process to occur. So at that time, there were 100 or so universities had tech transfer offices. It wasn't a skill or a career that anybody much knew. And so I got into it the way most people my age or with my experience got into it, which was completely by accident. My father-in-law's tennis partner was the head of tech transfer at Johns Hopkins. And so he had subsequently moved to Chapel Hill. My fiance, now wife, were also moving to Chapel Hill. And when we did our networking, this person, his name was Fran Meyer, he was the only person either of our families knew in Chapel Hill. So it was literally the only person I went in. I was a scientist, went in thinking maybe you could connect me to a good lab and I could get to work in the lab. And when Fran and I started talking, he said, well, I have a job in the office. If you just want a job, I have a job, and you could be a temp and do some data entry. When you don't have a job and someone says, would you like a job? The answer is always yes, of course. And so I just took the job as a temp and found it really interesting. And so my very first job was digitizing our files, taking 1,000 files and putting it into a database. And so ironically, now here we are 30 years later, and I'm running a very large office. And I can actually say to people, I've done every single job in this office because I have literally been the data entry analyst and taken almost every role from that point forward. And I did that for a year. And then he offered me a job as an entry-level licensing associate, which I was happy to take. And what was interesting, of course, was I had looked at 1,000 transactions because we had 1,000 folders. I didn't just put the data in, I read them, and I read the invention disclosures, and I read the correspondence, and I read the license agreements. And I would say effectively, I started teaching myself what tech transfer was by reading all these files and finding out either the things we did that went particularly well or the things that we did that didn't go particularly well. So you sort of were learning as I'm putting data in, what's a good way to do it or what are the risk profiles. So by the time I took the job as an actual licensing officer, I had seen hundreds and hundreds of patents and seen hundreds and hundreds of license agreements. And so things just took off from there. So I had very different roles at Chapel Hill. I ended up as the associate director for life sciences. And then there was a period where I was a little bit looking to do the next thing. And one of our startup companies, which was an IP platform of a startup, reached out to me after launch and said, would you like to join? And it happened to be anyone in tech transfer will tell you they have their babies, the projects that they love more than anything else. And this was my baby. And so they came back and said, do you want to come and join the company? And I did. So I actually switched sides and then went to work for the startup company founded on our technology, which is great and also humiliating to have to renegotiate your own license agreement, which I had to do. And then worked at that company for 8 years and then went back into tech transfer again. And then about a year and a half ago came to NYU.
I love that story. It's so vivid and gives you an in-depth understanding that so many don't have, but actually you were present at the creation of tech transfer. And then you really delved into it at a granular level in the beginning of your career as well.
Say one of the things that was really interesting, because you asked for examples of things that would show the tail, is fortunately or unfortunately, I've been doing this for long enough that I've actually seen products reach the market, which is really fundamentally interesting. One of them was I was part of the licensing team on the AAV vector systems that underpin most vaccines right now. So remembering seeing those in, the late 90s, early 2000s, and some of those systems wind up in the COVID vaccines that we've all used in small parts. There's dozens and dozens of technologies in those vaccines. But the example of the startup that I went to work with, and its name was Qualist, was I literally got to see an idea within the university, the first disclosure, the first time the faculty told us that this idea existed, made the decision to patent it, or to file the patent applications, then left and went to the company and then helped to try to implement that into the use case. And then those patents, the original versions of those patents just expired about 3 years ago. And so I had this really unique experience of seeing something literally from its genesis all the way to its introduction into the market, to proving value in the market, and then watching it sunset and have inspired other areas in science and commercialization. So that was really fascinating to see the whole picture from soup to nuts. And that's really evidence a lot of what I'm doing here at NYU and Langone Hill.
Yeah. And that's where I wanted to ask you about next, because that life cycle, I guess maybe one question, and this I'm sure varies by technology, but just to give listeners a sense of magnitude about how long does it take for that life cycle to run its course, so to speak, from that beginning point all the way through, assuming that it does get onto the market?
Very technology specific. So it probably wouldn't surprise anyone listening to this that software moves faster than therapeutics, but the therapeutics that reach the market tend to be 8, 12, 14 years from the time you first file the intellectual property to the time it reaches the market. There's a very small window of time when the industry partner has a chance to recoup the costs, because it can cost upward of $1 billion, $1.5 billion to bring a drug to market. And then think of all that time you're just spending money. So then by the time the patents come on, or by the time the product reaches the market, you have to find a way to get your money back, which is one of the issues that I think we're all fighting in terms of the value of technology once it reaches the market. So that's the long end of the train. I would say things in hardware tend to be in the middle. They might take 5, 7, 10 years to reach the market. And then there are software where we actually at NYU, one of the first startup companies that was founded after I got here it was founded in March and then was sold in September for $30 million. So sometimes it goes exceptionally fast and then we see the results of that go. So it honestly can be months to a year, all the way out to 10 or 15 years before you start to see the return, which is one of the reasons why I think universities are so important to the national and international economic development. Is what other industry could have the patience to wait 15 years to see if something happens? It has to be an organization that has a long history, that has stability, that has a heritage of innovation, so that we're not racing to say that next thing didn't reach the market. We should stop doing this. This is just kind of part of our DNA.
Yeah, such an important point. I want to ask you now more generally, Marc, because you've seen this industry from all these different perspectives, how you think that insight and those different viewpoints inform what you do today at NYU Langone?
A lot is the answer. Again, I have a pretty rare set of experiences where I've seen intellectual property as a creator, because my first job was actually as a food scientist, where I had a discovery that was patented that led to a product that wound up selling something like $300 million over the course of its lifetime. So I am an inventor of a now expired patent, and I'd seen things from the management of intellectual property from the university, then changed and went to the implementation side and ran a startup company based on it, and then have come back now and I'm looking at that more holistically. And what I would say is that with that set of experiences, I've looked at the process of commercialization from almost every aspect, as an inventor, as a manager, and as an implementer in this, it's running this biotech company. And each one of those has really educated how I look at the job now. So one, you're able to empathize with the person on the other side of the transaction to say, okay, I understand what you're trying to do. I have done it. Explain to me the challenges. So a lot of times when we have license discussion, and anytime you do a negotiation, if you agreed on everything, something's probably wrong, right? So you each have different perspectives on it. But a lot of times I will have chats with our partners on the other side of the transaction and say, what are your needs? What are the things that are really in the way? And if you give me, one of my favorite phrases I use is, if you give me a have to have, I will find a way to give it to you. If you give me a nice to have, we're going to have a discussion, because the have to haves get in the way between where you are and the commercialization of the product. And we really have to understand those fundamentally, but they have to be have to haves. Without this, we can't go forward. Without this, we can't make an investment. Without this, the commercialization will be unsuccessful. Everything else is just really about creating an understanding of what the overall value is of the technology and the fair share of each of those pieces are. But the second piece is, I think, having again been on all sides and run a biotech company that was founded out of a university and had to pay people's mortgages based on that. You understand the responsibility you have to the employees, the responsibility you have to your customers, the responsibility you have to society to do things that matter. And so that's a place when I first started, all I was thinking about is, how do I get the next transaction? How do I get the next deal done? How do I show that I know what I'm doing? Almost 30 years later, I tend to look at it from, what are we trying to do? What are the benefits? And to try to put myself and our staff in the position to understand all of the other stakeholders in the transaction, from our faculty to the institution, to our partners, to the region, to society, and really try to make sure that we're always focused on the totality of what we're trying to do. Another phrase I use a lot is, we serve the idea, and that we do what's in the best interests of the idea. And sometimes that means we don't necessarily do the thing that's absolute best for us, but by serving the idea, we increase the chances that something is going to reach society and make the world a little better. And then again, the last piece of the puzzle is, gets into industry, it creates jobs. Those jobs pay taxes. Those people pay mortgages. You really get a very tangible benefit. It's not just a piece of paper. It's not just a patent out in the ether. It's an opportunity, and that dozens of people get to share in that opportunity from concept to market. And that our job is to just try to make that easier, better, faster, and more beneficial.
As you're talking, Mark, your passion is really coming through, and I'm sure listeners are picking up on that. And some may be shaking their heads in agreement and getting fired up about perhaps a career in an aspect of tech transfer. And when you and I had a chance to talk offline, I think you described tech transfer as a hub where people with all sorts of professional backgrounds converge to collaborate and also a launching pad to a broad spectrum of other careers. So I would love if you could share some examples of the various tech transfer roles. You did touch on some and the breadth of academic backgrounds that are suitable for performing them effectively.
Sure. Yeah. I always say that tech transfer is the Venn diagram of science, law, and business. And so in the center of those three circles sits the role of technology transfer, because we need to understand the science fundamentally to know what the opportunity is. We need to understand intellectual property and corporate law to know how to best get the idea into whatever form it needs to be in so that it can commercialize. And then the business opportunity of knowing the value of what we have to offer. And in some cases, realizing that maybe an existing company is not the best way to get this going forward, but it really is something where we need to create a startup, a purpose-built vehicle to bring that forward. And that's a decision that isn't always obvious when we choose to do a startup. Sometimes it's too risky and nobody else will do the work. Or what you really want to say from a business perspective is this idea is so important that you want an organization whose only job is to get this idea to the market and not have it be one of 100 ideas, but just have it be one of one ideas to focus it through. So in terms of the roles, and I'll just take our office at Langone Health, for example, and just to be clear for everybody who's listening, I say Langone Health and NYU, and I flip-flop between the two of them because I work at NYU Langone Health. That is my official employer, but I serve the entire university. So we work with the intellectual property of New York University, the breadth and depth of all of that, from computer science to biology to machine learning and all points in between. And we have a wonderful, even the Tisch School of the Arts has some intellectual property that we can use. And then Langone Health is the med school and the healthcare system. So it's a pretty big job, but I just want to make sure everybody understands I'm not just working in life sciences. Our group works across basically every discipline that there is to do. And we do about 1.2 billion research. So in that, our organization, we have licensing managers and business development managers, and their job is to look around and do what we call search and evaluate, find the ideas wherever they are. They're in the lab meetings, they're in department meetings, they're engaging with the faculty where they live and what they're doing. We have people a director of intellectual property and her team, paralegals, and they're filing patents and working with outside counsel to make sure that the patents that we don't file ourselves are being handled well, and that we're reviewing comments from our licensees when they say, we'd like the patent to look like this, that we're making sure that we capture all of the value and that we're continuing to keep broad platform technologies. We have just pure business development people who are out there walking around trying to partner with industry and focused on what the market needs are. We're the first university in the United States, if not the world, to have a dedicated diligence analyst for our startup opportunities. Since we have a venture fund that's a captive venture fund from Langone Health, we have a person who spent 7 years at Silicon Valley Bank, and he's doing investment grade due diligence on these opportunities so that if we put our money in these deals, that we feel like we've made a decision, we're making a rational decision, we're making a business decision, we're making a financially advantageous decision to put our capital to work in that particular way. Accountants and finance people and all points in between. So if I go back to the original definition of the Venn diagram between science, law, and business, we probably have 10 different career paths just in my office of a staff of 35, which is why it's a big tent. And we often see people hop between them. We'll see someone who starts off as a licensing manager and they say, oh, actually, I want to do the contracts. So actually, and that was one I missed. We have a contracts team, which is lawyers. We're doing not the law part because there are attorneys that do that, but they're doing the licensing transactions. So a business development manager might say, I actually like the contract side. So I'm going to switch and I'm just going to do all contracts. Or we have contracts people who decide they want to go into intellectual property. And so we try to keep it flexible and allow people to shift to the places where their passions are. but which again, in an office of 35, whatever we have right now, that's how we give people professional development opportunities. That's how we help them grow. And it's the thing I focus on as a manager is to make sure if you're in a job in the office, that it's a job you love and it's a job you're excited about and it's a job that you want to come to every day. And so if that means hopping disciplines or hopping focus areas, that's perfectly fine with me because we have 9 other choices for you, generally speaking.
Mhm. Interesting, because as I hear you say that, it reflects a little bit your movement on a smaller scale. So if someone brings to that new role the knowledge that they gained from the previous role, so, they maybe see the field even more clearly or more broadly.
I think that's true. And people ask me a lot of times, how do I either get into tech transfer or what's the phenotype to be successful in tech transfer? And my answer is always the same. Somebody with intellectual curiosity. It's just wanting to know the answer, wanting to figure out what your piece of the puzzle is, wanting to be a proactive participant in getting this technology into the market. Those are the people that do really well. People who come in and say, this is what I want to do and I only ever want to do this, tend not to work out because you have to be at some level a little bit multidisciplinary in your brain, even if it's not in your experience.
Fascinating. So as we wrap up, and actually this question builds on what you just said, Mark, I'm sure some of our listeners are wondering how they could explore the field in greater detail, where they might be able to educate themselves, whether they're in a job right now or they're still within a university, either on the administration side or perhaps still working on their degree.
Yeah, that's a great question. And probably, I would say I spend 5 hours a week talking to people who in some way, shape, or form on this issue who are intrigued by the concept or have always wanted to get into tech transfer. It is a little bit tough to get your foot in the door. I will readily admit that, even though opportunities are continue to increase and our offices continue to expand. There are a lot of people who have experience in other industries who say, well, I really want to get into tech transfer. And how do I do it? The most common paths in are from graduating PhDs or graduating master's students in the degree granting institute. So we have an internship program that's run primarily by Sadma Chinley, who's now on the board of directors of Autumn, which is the Global Tech Transfer Association, who's run an internship program for years. And it's getting scientists who aren't quite sure they want to be bench scientists anymore and giving them exposure to other things. And so I know lots of universities use that as a way to get additional work in the office done, but also give people exposure. So if you're a scientist who looks at that pipetter and says, I don't know that I can do this one more time, tech transfer is a great way to be involved in science without actually having to perform science. And what I would encourage you to do is go talk to the tech transfer office director and ask if there are programs or there are internships or if there are ways to come in and help. Most offices will find a way to have some student engagement. That, in this case, student meaning graduate student, postdocs, but there's probably only a handful of opportunities there every year. From the outside coming in, meaning outside of academia, and more, you see universities looking for external people to populate the tech transfer office. I will tell you personally, the one thing I look for in a resume is industry experience. More than anything else, I'd rather have someone who had a handful of years in the university, but a 10-year career in industry helping to commercialize technology. That's going to be somebody who's going to be very attractive to me because we have lots of people that understand universities. We don't have as many people that understand how industry takes in technology and how to successfully do the handoff. So for people maybe thinking about coming in from industry, generally we're looking for subject matter experts. We're looking for somebody who was on the business development team in industry. We don't always look for scientists from industry. A scientist in industry is similar to, though not exactly the same as a scientist in academia. So when we're looking for folks who maybe don't have experience in tech transfer, but are coming from our corporate partners, we're looking for them to have been part of processes that bring technologies to the market, either in the manufacturing side, in the business development side, the IP and process side, because every time we can bring somebody with industry experience in, we gain a little insight in terms of what industry does and what they would like. And that's our job, is to figure out how do we get these things into the hands of our partners. Those are pretty much the two ways that I see people come in. And then I guess the last piece, and I see this a lot, and this is the fatal flaw of a lot of people that want to get into this as a career, is that they start by saying, like, academia is broken and I want to fix it. And my response is always, academia isn't broken. It's probably the second oldest profession in the world is teaching. Universities have been around for hundreds of years. The oldest universities have been around for over 1,000. And there's a reason that those organizations live. It's because the business model of educating people is pretty effective. And so my pet peeve is when people come at a university and say, you're doing it all wrong. Let's behave like a business. When the answer is no, we don't want to do that. We want to act with good, solid business principles and good, solid business practice. But you have to have a love for the academy. You have to have a love for researchers doing research. And you have to have a real appreciation for what universities are and aren't. And by universities, nonprofit hospitals, research centers, they're all in the same mix. If universities were here to develop products, we would just be companies because that's what companies do. That's not our job. Our job is to create knowledge and disseminate knowledge at the core. And a lot of people will say, a friend of mine in the UK said the most effective technology transfer activity every year is graduation. When all these students go out into the world and they take their knowledge that they learned at the institution and they go out and they transfer it into the world. So you have to have a respect for that. You have to have a respect for blue sky research because the internet doesn't come about because somebody said, you know what, I'd like to create the internet. It comes about because two scientists said, well, we have to figure out how to send data from point to point in a way that's a little more effective. Let's see if we can come up with a protocol that will allow us to do this freely. So, you have to have people who are really thinking non-practically about science and just thinking about what's out there and how do we discover something that's never been discoverable. The role of tech transfer and the role of industry is to say, that's a really interesting observation. I think we can put a business case around this, or I think we could put a commercialization case around what you've done and bring it to market. One of my biggest fears in the United States particularly is tech transfer is super effective. I could share some data with you in a second about how effective that actually is. But we don't want to kill the goose that laid the golden egg. We don't want universities only focused on applied research. We don't want people only focused on how do I create products or licensable IP. We want to find that balance between inquiry and open-ended scholarship, which is where these ideas come from. And then the finding and being opportunistic about the application of that science. So I often call tech transfer managing serendipity. It's the researchers do what they do. And every once in a while, a little comet shoots out and says, well, this is a really interesting idea. And we have to have a structure and people and talent and relationships and money to take advantage of that serendipity and turn it into something that might be tomorrow's internet or a new drug or a new computer chip or something like that. I gave a long answer to a pretty simple question, but what I was trying to do is get a little bit of a feel for what makes us tick, because that's probably the place where I see the biggest disconnect with both people wanting to get into the institution and also when we work with our partners of trying to make sure they understand what motivates us to get up every day and do what we do.
That was a wonderful answer. And it really is going to be helpful for folks to understand just beyond what they can maybe Google about tech transfer. That really gets to the spirit and the reason for being. And it's not obvious for folks on the outside. You also, Marc, mentioned Autumn and AUTM for listeners. And there is a Autumn conference coming up in February, which I'm actually going to be at. I'm excited to be going
Great.
back to Austin, Texas. And so we're going to include a link to the Autumn conference in the show notes that accompany this episode so that if you're interested in learning more about Autumn or have some training grants or you have some professional development grants or funding that you haven't used yet or want to allocate to this, then you can go to the conference.
Sounds great. Yeah, I will be there. So I'm stoked to see people there soon.
Great. You can continue this conversation with Marc if he has time in Austin. Marc Sedam, this was a wonderful conversation, really helpful, nuanced, and really information packed. Thank you for taking the time out. As you pointed out, you've got a huge playing field there in New York. all across the university and are really helping to serve the idea, you and your staff. Thank you for taking the time for that, and also for the work that you and your staff and your team are doing to bring these ideas into the market that can make such an important impact.
That is why we wake up every day. Thanks, Mark. I appreciate the time.
Sure, of course. And listeners, thanks for taking time to be here on this episode of When Science Speaks. And I hope you'll be back next time for the next episode of When Science Speaks.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to click subscribe. Check us out on the web at whensciencespeaks.com, and we'll see you next time.